The first time I tried 29 dots, it was in the upper 20s, and I guess safe to say I went through my skin pretty quickly. The route felt really, really hard, and I couldn't imagine actually ever being up there without a rope. A few days later, with about 20 degrees less, the route felt completely different, and I began to feel really excited at the prospect of possibly doing it. I've always tried to be really calculated with my risk management, and this is especially true now that I'm a dad. When I climb a dangerous route like this, I want it to feel like there's literally 0% chance that I could fall off. I want the moves to feel easy, I want the sequence to flow, and the end result is a really zen-like experience where I feel like I can float up the route in a bubble of calm. However, I was having a real problem with numb fingers due to the cold and windy conditions. Yet for some reason I carried on regardless, believing that everything would turn out okay. After spending way too much time than was sensible working the route on a rope, my skin was really thin and I was feeling pretty tired. Yet I still took what few pads we had in the van and set them up on the floor, telling myself and Caro that I was just going to boulder out the bottom section. At this point, I think I knew if I got through the bottom, I would probably push onto the top, but for some reason I didn't really feel comfortable saying that out loud. It's really not normal for me to set off on a dangerous route with this mindset. So eventually I pulled on and the moves felt amazing, and I really felt myself climbing with an ease that I associate with climbing routes like this. Suddenly, however, at the penultimate move of the crux, I just felt tired and heavy, and in a moment of doubt I found myself thinking, I might fall off this next move. I'm pretty certain I didn't give it 100%, and I came up a little bit short on the hold that signifies the end of the hardest climbing, and the last place you could safely fall off. The fall was long and the landing came as a bit of a shock. Maybe I was simply tired, or maybe this was a last-ditch effort from my subconscious at giving me a way out. I wouldn't want to take that fall many times in a day, but what makes it justifiable is that you fall in a pretty safe manner as you're climbing in a very front-on position. I wondered if the last warm-up try of the route hadn't tired me out a little bit too much. So I decided that on my next try, I'd set off after a longer rest without any specific warm-up. Looking back now, there was no way this was ever going to work. I was already having a lot of trouble with numb fingers, and so pulling back on without a real warm-up for my fingers was almost guaranteeing that I would numb out further up the route. Again, what I needed to do was to pack up and go home and come back another day, well rested, and to give the route the respect that it deserves and ultimately really enjoy the experience. Before I set off, I went through my usual routine. I didn't actually feel scared or intimidated or anything like that. And to me, that shows that I genuinely believed everything would be all right and that this would play out just like so many other dangerous routes I've climbed before. I'm not really sure if this is a good thing that shows how well I am at controlling my emotions, or a bad thing showing just how easily I can trick myself. Anyway, I threw my jacket on the floor underneath the start of the route because I didn't want to sacrifice any of my crash pads, cleaned my feet, and set off again. Once more, the moves felt great. The sharp crimps dug into my skin, and I felt really locked onto the holds. This section's probably around Font 8A, and the moves get harder and harder until the move that I fell off on my previous attempt. There's actually one hold that isn't a tiny sharp crimp, and although it's a very good hold, it's facing completely the wrong direction. It's a bit of an awkward stab to catch this weird shoulder gaston, and the way that you get it defines how easy or impossible the next crux move is going to feel. Catching this hold felt harder than I would have hoped, but slightly better than the time before. So I readjusted as best I could and committed to the hardest moves of the route, with everything I had, eventually catching this slopey edge at full stretch. From this point, you swing your feet across into a tenuous position on the arête where you can actually have a couple of shakes. It's nice to have a breather here because even though the hardest climbing is finished, there's still a difficult section just above that felt to me around, 7A plus, 7B as a boulder problem. Hard enough that it took me a couple of tries to figure out the moves. Unfortunately, on the go, I couldn't stay here. I could already feel the beginning of numbness starting to set in, and I knew if I tried to rest, I'd lose all feeling in my fingers. In hindsight, this would have been a good decision because technically, I could have still dropped off from here. But in the moment, I felt like if I pushed on, I might be able to race the numbness to the top. The next left handhold is a really strange gaston with a series of spikes for your fingers, and I knew something was wrong when I took this hold and couldn't properly feel my index. I've had this before on hard and dangerous head points where your mind is almost a couple of moves behind your body. And by the time you've had a chance to think about something, your body's already done the next move. I committed to putting my right foot up, which is, in my opinion, probably the beginning of where things to get really dangerous. The next move's this awkward crossover into a slightly better right hand hold that only works if you put a lot of pressure on your right foot. If the hand or foot slips from this position, then the fall will probably be pretty nasty. You're going to fall in a much more uncontrolled sideways manner, and you're already quite a bit higher than where I fell before. From this point on, I'd say that bouldering is over and you're definitely into solo territory. I had to move a lot more dynamically to the left hand hold than I would have liked, and this is where the alarm bells really began to ring. Though this hold is quite good, I was really struggling to feel it under my numbing fingers and knew that I was massively over gripping, which also meant I was quickly getting pumped. The next move is a long semi-static lunge to a good cluster of crystals, but I felt like I just didn't have the control I really needed, and so I had to make the move a lot more dynamically than I would have liked. Thankfully, I caught the hold, but once again I was shocked to realise how bad it was feeling. I was really starting to worry at this point, and began thinking about how high I might have climbed above the point where I felt it was safe to fall off, and wondering if there was anything I could do to actually fix this situation. Again, my body took over and left my mind behind, and I made it one move further into the first really good hold. This really should have been the end of all the hard climbing. I know the next move is still quite physical and committing, but it's significantly easier than anything else that's come before. Unfortunately, at this point, I really couldn't feel anything in my hands. I know the hold is good, and I know there are these little dimples that make it feel even better, so I really try to visually inspect the hold to put my fingers in just the right place, but it kind of feels like I'm grabbing onto a big block of ice. Maybe it's because the difficulty decreased enough that I could regain some lucidity, but it was here when, mentally speaking, things really started to fall apart. For the first time in a long time, I began thinking about the consequences of falling, and even worse, what that might mean to Kara and the kids waiting down below. I really began to scold myself for putting them in this position before realising those kind of thoughts had absolutely no place up here, and the only thing that mattered right now was getting to the top. The last few metres of the route are pretty trivial in comparison to the climbing below, yet I climbed them, well, literally like my life depended on it. I was over-gripping and over-controlling every single move because I couldn't trust the signals coming from my hands. At some point, I actually stopped to look at my hands to check that everything was okay. I wondered if I could have maybe split a tip and perhaps they were covered in blood and that's why they felt so slippery. But no, they were just white and cold and numb. I slowly made it the last couple of moves up to the top, and when I realised I was finally safe, there was no joy, no elation, just relief and shame. If I try to look at things positively, I can tell myself that in some way I'm happy I had this experience because I'm pretty sure it's going to keep me safer in the future. I feel like since Harder Faster in 2020, I was beginning to slide down a very slippery slope, and hopefully this experience will remind me that it's okay to put the brakes on from time to time. In reality, however, I'm mainly disappointed with the choice I made on that day, both selfishly for throwing away the chance to have another really enjoyable experience on a beautiful and proud piece of rock, but mainly for putting my loved ones in that awful position, all for a bit of climbing.